Good morning, everybody. I guess the first thing to say is you may notice the title of the paper has changed from what was advertised. As I was putting the paper together, so it was going to be called Millennials, Are They Who We Think They Are? And as I was putting the paper together, I kind of thought, actually, is it a useful label? You start thinking about millennials and Gen X and Gen Y and baby boomers and all of these different kind of labels that we have for different demographics. And I sort of thought, is it actually a useful term for us to be thinking about this group of people as millennials? Does it help us as researchers, as brand managers, to kind of think about this group in this way? So that's where I'm going to start off with, really. And I guess to sort of think about these different types of demographics. So I was born in 1981. That's a picture of me when the world was brown, apparently, according to that photograph. And so technically that makes me a millennial because the standard definition of millennials is that they were born from the kind of early 1980s through to the early 2000s. So that technically makes me a millennial, but actually, as I started to look into this, maybe it actually makes me a late Gen Z, because according to Wikipedia, Generation Z is to 1981. That's from kind of the 60s to 1981. So maybe I'm an early millennial, or maybe I'm a late Gen Z, or actually maybe I'm a Zennial, which is this term that people have been talking about more recently, which is this kind of micro-generation born between the sort of Star Wars trilogy originally from 1977 to 1983. And that kind of makes sense to me, actually, because I remember the days of using Alta Vista as a search engine. I remember the days of, growing up without the internet and then kind of using dial-up modems. As I say, using Alta Vista as a search engine before Google came along. Analog childhood, kind of digital sort of adulthood as I got a bit older. So that kind of makes sense to me. And I just started to think, are these labels even helpful to us? And actually, is it just confusing things? Actually, I think these labels can be helpful. I think they can help us to think about the macro environment in which people experience their lives, in which their formative years happened, the macro environment around them that kind of shapes their thinking, their behavior, and their needs. But I think we have to be careful that we don't lump everybody together and assume that all millennials are the same, because clearly somebody born in the early 80s like myself is going to be quite different from somebody who was born in the early 2000s and have had kind of different experiences, different things shaping their ideals and their kind of experiences. But I think it is useful because, if you think about millennials as a group, as a kind of key demographic, they have grown up with a very different kind of macro environment to those generations that came before them. So as I mentioned, if we think about millennials and if we accept that it can be a useful term as long as we don't group everybody up and assume they're always the same, this is the group, as I mentioned, that were born between the early 1980s and the early 2000s. And globally, they are really of interest to brands as they're moving into their kind of prime spending years. Brands are taking much more interested in this particular demographic. They've grown up through digital revolution, through lots of other macro changes. Global recession happened a few years ago, and that's something that's affected a lot of people. They've grown up within that time, not necessarily knowing a different environment. And we've also had things like rapid urbanization, growing middle classes, and this backdrop has given that demographic cohort a very different set of expectations, very different from previous generations. And I guess the millennial mindset is typically characterized as valuing authenticity, having a desire for autonomy, and being more socially minded than those generations that have maybe come before them. So thinking about millennials, I think it can be useful to understand how those factors have shaped their mindsets. But fundamentally, what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand people. Now, some of you who have heard me speaking before may have heard me talking about this idea of happiness, because at Join the Dots, we believe that to understand people, we need to understand what motivates us as humans, not even as consumers, just as people. And we believe that that's the need to increase happiness. When I presented this before, we talked about 5 different underlying drivers of happiness, and that's based on a lot of the academic theory around positive psychology, like the work of Martin Seligman, for example, that has these 5 underlying drivers of human happiness. A lot of that thinking is based on Western academic research. So when we came out to Singapore a couple of years ago, we've spent a lot of time kind of remapping these drivers to say, actually, if you look at these in the context of Asia, do they still work? Are they still relevant? And actually, they are still relevant, but we've added 2 more drivers, which are health and security. Now, these aren't specific to Asia necessarily, but as we started to look at it, these are the bottom 2 on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And a lot of academic researchers kind of ignore them and take them for granted. And they probably shouldn't, because you can think about security as, political security, social security. There's lots of different aspects to it. And although we've remapped them as part of our work in Asia, we actually apply these globally now. So we've got these kind of 7 universal drivers of happiness that we use around the world in our work. And these drivers are universal across different markets and across different demographics. But actually, the way that those drivers are manifested, the way they play out, varies quite significantly dependent on the local culture, the local market, the particular demographic that you're talking to. So although these are kind of universal drivers, they vary quite considerably dependent on the market and the culture and the demographic that you're looking at. So what I'm going to do now, and quite a nice segue from what Stephen was just saying there, is I'm going to spend a bit of time looking at millennials in Singapore and Hong Kong, and I'm going to explain some of our happiness drivers in relation to them. What I'm going to talk about is going to be based a bit more on some of our internal thinking, our internal frameworks, some of the academic work, some secondary research and some consultation that we've done with our network of consultants that are kind of around the world, really. We call that our Illume network. So I'm not going to be presenting data necessarily, I'm going to be presenting some thinking. So why Singapore and Hong Kong? Obviously we're in Singapore, we thought it would be interesting to present something that's a little bit more local. But also because people often compare Singapore and Hong Kong, as kind of 2 major cities in the region, lots of similarities in terms of, the economy and business and all of those sorts of things. And I think it's quite easy for people to do that without necessarily taking into account the cultural context and actually some very different cultural contexts within Singapore and Hong Kong. Cultural identification differs quite considerably. To understand what it means to be from Hong Kong, you have to understand the influence of Cantonese culture, for example, and the values there that have been shaping that local mindset. Whereas in Singapore, multiracialism is obviously one of the building blocks of society. Bilingualism is enforced, and holidays across different racial groups are celebrated. So there's some pretty fundamental differences, and even down to kind of, the political situation in both different markets. But despite these very fundamental differences, we've looked at millennials in these 2 different cities to look at their values, their outlooks, and their lifestyles. And because I've only got 20 minutes, we're not going to cover all of these different drivers. If anybody is interested, we've got a full kind of paper on this, and we've got some copies with us if people want to take that away afterwards. It's also been published as a series of articles on RW Connect, SMR's website as well at the moment. So if you're interested, there's kind of a lot more that sits behind this. But for now, we're just going to focus on three of these drivers, which are achievement, meaning, and relationships. Okay, so we're going to start with achievements. And the idea of achievements as this happiness driver is it's about a personal sense of achievement. And that can be any type of challenge, really, where you learn something new. Now, millennials in both Hong Kong and Singapore are brought up to be competitive. They both experience quite challenging education systems. In both cities, there are kind of high expectations for achievement from both family and from society more generally. But in Hong Kong, I guess those values of kind of pragmatism and being success-driven still very much inform the way that millennials view success and achievements. If we look at this, there was a study published by LinkedIn recently, and that revealed that affluent millennials in Hong Kong still believe in this idea of the Hong Kong dream. And that's something which is defined as success and prosperity through hard work, through determination, and through initiative. But actually, the scope of what makes a good career in Hong Kong is changing. Hong Kong millennials are still very status conscious, but many of them hold quite different, more practical aspirations. And the focus that they have to achieve is increasingly being directed across different paths, such as entrepreneurship. If we look at Singapore, Singapore millennials are really looking to redefine the idea of the 5 Cs, so kind of those traditional 5 Cs of cash, car, condo, club membership, and credit card, now become things like creativity, collaboration, compassion, confidence, and contribution. So they're looking to kind of think about those old, more pragmatic ideals in a slightly different way. They've grown up with a different set of expectations, with a different macro environment, and they're thinking about those kind of quite differently. So they're redefining the definitions of success. They're running startup businesses, they're founding their own companies. You can see the proliferation of co-working spaces, for example, across Singapore. So many kind of startups and entrepreneurs, and that kind of mindset of, I want to do something for me, I want to kind of forge my own path and do something that's maybe a bit different from what previous generations did. And I think even in terms of the workplace culture, that's having an impact. So they're kind of replacing some of those more traditional ways of working with more transparency, with more honesty, and even this idea of embracing failure as well and saying it's okay not to succeed first time. We can try again and we can experiment and do something a bit different. So they're changing the definition of success and looking for it on their own terms. If we look at this idea of meaning, and I guess this happiness driver kind of refers to having a sense of purpose in life, maybe feeling connected to something bigger than the self, so having that sense of meaning through something. And in a lot of countries, that's facilitated by cultural traditions or by religious faiths, whereas in more secular societies, meaning can be provided by a sort of sense of community, and maybe a local community or a kind of interest group community, for example. But if we look at millennials, they're a generation of change makers. They want to be heard, they want to use their voice to drive change, to kind of create positive effect on the communities and on the world around them. So Hong Kong millennials are trying to do this to kind of effect positive change within Hong Kong. And part of that is driven by their own search for a kind of local identity. So one survey found that about 8 out of 10 18 to 29-year-olds in Hong Kong identify themselves as people from Hong Kong, and only 13% identified themselves as primarily Chinese. So as a generation that have always been kind of less Chinese than the previous generations in Hong Kong, millennials are leading this change as kind of crusaders of a local identity. And as the most connected population in Asia, they're using different platforms to make their voices heard. So, for example, earlier this year, when the election was underway, a lot of people were actually videoing themselves and live streaming themselves, just going about their day-to-day work, just to kind of show their lack of participation in the election and their lack of support for the election. Whereas if you go back to 2014, actually, they were on the streets demonstrating. So they're using this way of protesting, this way of making their voice heard in different ways, and they're moving that more online than necessarily just taking that offline into the streets. If we look at Singapore, millennials here are looking to be part of an engine of change. They're protecting local culture, local heritage, local identity. So they're kind of similar themes, but actually they're playing out in quite different ways. And as digital natives, they're also harnessing the power of technology to further causes and messages. I guess some examples of this idea of being socially united or being part of this kind of protector of culture and identity. You know, we've got young hawkers stepping up to preserve local hawker food and local kind of delicacies. You've got socially conscious startups such as the Dorsal Effect, for example, on the rise in Singapore. And even more contentious topics like pink.sg are really gaining prominence over the last couple of years, despite all of the obstacles that are set in place. So millennials in both cities are feeling responsible really for shaping their present and for shaping the future of these two cities. But the way that is manifested actually is driven by the cultural context. It's driven by what happens within the society, the context that they've grown up in, and those local cultures. The third one is around relationships. So this driver not only includes this idea of kind of being cared for and being loved by other people, or being just happy with your social network, but it's also about feeling integrated with a society or a community, because much of our experience as humans revolves around other people. Maintaining relationships is pretty fundamental for most people. It's particularly the case in Asia, and actually it's no different for millennials when we look at them. But when it comes to matters of the heart, we do find that finding love in urban cities is quite challenging for them. So millennials in both Singapore and Hong Kong still face some strong pressures to marry, to have children. In Hong Kong, high living costs actually have an impact on this, and not only on things like consumption and ownership, but also on the relationships that people have. So a study by Citibank revealed that about half of middle-class millennials, unmarried people, are delaying marriage so that they can save up. And nearly half of unmarried people think it's too expensive to have a child. So actually, that cultural context, that context of where they're living is impacting on the relationships. It's impacting on whether they're going to get married, whether they're going to have children. And because the home ownership is inaccessible, Hong Kong actually has the highest proportion of millennials globally. It's 84% who are still living in the family home, and most of them have no plans to leave in the foreseeable future. We look at Singapore in contrast. Singaporeans have often been associated with being unromantic. It's been teased that the Singaporean way of proposal leads not with a ring, but shall we get an HDB flat? And the conversation on romance is often quite pragmatic, it's often quite functional and practical. And there's obviously a kind of strong top-down government-led initiative encouraging people to get married and to have children. But actually, it's really challenging for people. Another survey found that 85% of people in Singapore said they find dating more challenging these days than they did a decade ago, which actually is a little bit disheartening. Like, are they all still single after 10 years? Maybe that's a little bit sad. But with kind of high social media usage here in Singapore, there's a proliferation of dating apps to try and help Singaporean singles to meet that someone special. So those are kind of three of the drivers. Oops, we went backwards. And some of the ways that they're playing out in these two kind of similar but also very different cities. And we can see there are some similarities there when we look at the themes, when we look at what's happening. But they're driven, the kind of what's happening is actually driven by these underlying different cultural contexts. So similar behaviors, similar things going on, but very different in terms of the culture. But what does this mean for brands? So I guess millennials are kind of curators of their own lives. They're trying to forge this new path. They're trying to do something that's a little bit different from the generations that came before them. They're redefining, for example, what it means to be successful. They're disrupting these more traditional paths in life. So I think brands that can offer more freedom and flexibility by maybe giving millennials more control over their personal environments are those that are going to be sought out. Millennials will be looking for brands that offer them immersive experiences and actually help them to find their own way. Self-expression is also really important for this group. So we've seen that millennials like to share their opinions and experiences. We've talked earlier about social media in Singapore, for example, as well, and kind of how important that is. And this is about sharing experiences and opinions both online and offline, actually. But this self-expression takes on very different forms dependent on the specific market. So I think millennials are going to be more willing to back brands that kind of help them to voice these opinions, help them to express their individuality, but also while celebrating difference and kind of individualism and greater self-expression. So I think for millennials, it's really about being authentic, it's about being honest, and it's about being true to themselves. And brands that can help millennials to do this are going to be those that are sought out. And I guess the third thing here is if we think about this idea of meaning and you know, connection to something bigger than the self, millennials are looking for meaning in what they do. They want to be able to affect positive change in the world around them. They want to be connected to their societies, to their communities, and see themselves as part of something bigger. So they're looking for brands that can help them form meaningful connections by being part of these chains of goodwill, providing a framework for them to come together and share something meaningful as a society. So that might seem a little bit abstract, so I'll give you a couple of examples of different brands that we think are actually tapping into some of these underlying needs. So there's a brand, I don't know if you've come across this or not, so Ascot Limited in 2016 launched a new brand called LifeLIF. which is up there. It's actually being developed in Farrer Park here in Singapore at the moment, and it's slated to open in 2020, but it's currently under testing at SMU. And this effectively is a co-living and collaboration space which is designed by millennials for millennials. And it's kind of tapping into this millennial value and need for connection, this desire for autonomy, and this desire for discovery as well. And the picture up there is a kind of concept of one of the co-living spaces. The next one is a Chinese online travel agency called Ctrip, and this launched a campaign to target millennials in Hong Kong. And the campaign was all kind of about, what does freedom mean? And they focused and featured people from Hong Kong talking about what freedom means to them. So again, they're kind of tapping into this idea of individuality, of freedom, of kind of, creativity, for example, and featuring these people's personal stories so that the audience has a connection with them to kind of connect them a bit more closely to the brand. And the third one is Tiger Beer, kind of seen as the quintessential Asian brand to a lot of people. Its Uncaged campaign, which to be fair, has received its fair share of criticism and controversies. It's featured people across Asia kind of breaking down walls, creating their own world and celebrating this idea of breaking boundaries, which again very much taps into the millennial mindset of forging their own path, of being individual, of doing something that's a little bit different. And it's taken the theme really to suit these different cultural contexts in Hong Kong and Singapore, attempting to kind of unleash this idea of can do and I am different through its advertising. And these are values that millennials in both cities can very clearly identify with. So what does this mean for us? Like, what can we think about as researchers? I think there are a few things. We've talked about this idea that millennials have kind of grown up or grown used to, depending on which end of the millennial spectrum they're in, this idea of kind of a digital world, of being connected, of wanting creativity, of wanting to forge their own paths. We have to remember that as digitally savvy millennials, they don't have time and the inclination to take part in lots of boring research. So, we need to think creatively. We need to think, how can we engage with these people on their terms in a way that is going to interest them, that's going to excite them, that's going to keep them coming back and engaging with us. So we've got to think creatively about how we do that. And I guess some of the things that we can think about are using gamification strategies, for example. We can think about personalizing tasks. If millennials are looking for things that brands that talk to them as individuals and treat them as individuals and help them to do that, can we personalize the way that we interact with millennials in some way based on other things that they tell us, based on the types of things we know they're interested in? Can we do things like use emojis? I've kind of talked about this before, but actually, can we just mirror the way that they're interacting online in real life within the research that we do? Can we do things like mood boards and collages? Can we help them to kind of be curators in the way that they are with their own lives? We saw Stephen present earlier about Instagram. Lots of young people are using Instagram. Can we mirror this type of technique in the research that we do? And can we help them to tap into this idea of driving change, this underlying value that they have for, driving change, whether that's within their local community or within something bigger? One of the things that we do within our online communities is we find it really important to give people feedback about how their views have helped a brand to choose an advertisement or drive change or drive product development. And it's a really important driver to keep people engaged and keep them motivated. And if you think about that underlying need that millennials have for, feeling that they're part of something, being part of a community, being part of something that's affecting change, can we tap into that with the research? Can we be, helping them feel part of our community? And helping them understand that their values and their views are really helping this brand to drive change. It's worth saying, actually, we shouldn't just be thinking about this for millennials. While we can probably be a bit more experimental with the techniques and the tools that we use with millennials because of the environment in which they've grown up, we shouldn't be asking anybody to do lots of really boring surveys or lots of really boring research if we want them to keep coming back. So while I'm talking about this in relation to millennials, we should really be thinking about this more generally in all of the research that we do. So I guess just to go back to where we started with, which was millennials, is it a useful label? I think it is. I think what we need to remember is that millennials come in lots of different shapes and sizes. They come in different kind of ages. So, as I say, somebody at the kind of, one of those early millennials might be quite different from a later millennial, for example, but also dependent on the specific culture in which they've grown up. So while some of those underlying needs for autonomy, for example, or for individualism, or for being more socially minded, might be consistent across different markets, they're going to be shaped by the local culture and the local values and the context in which they've grown up, which means they're going to be manifested quite differently. So I think it helps us to think about millennials as a group to show how they're different from previous generations and how that macro environment in which they've grown up has helped to shape those needs and behaviours. So I think ultimately, if it's a way of helping us understand people, then I think the term millennials is useful, but just use it with caution and don't assume that everybody's the same. Thank you.